Welcome back to another episode of Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about something that maybe you've never heard before, and that's the concept of learned helplessness. Maybe you're wondering what that is. Well, let's take some time to break it down, and then let's talk about some of the issues that come along with it. Now, learned helplessness, we know what it means to learn. So you don't know something, and someone teaches you how to do something. But then you focus on the idea of helplessness and how that works. Like, what does it mean to be helpless? In other words, not that you're truly without any help, but typically when we talk about someone being helpless, it's one of those situations where they don't know how to do things on their own, or maybe they choose not to, or maybe they lack the desire or drive to, maybe they don't have the tools to, but either way, there's something they just can't do, they don't know how to do. How does someone get to become in a state of helplessness? Typically it's one of those situations where maybe they are pushed into a situation where they can't go any further because their skill set only goes so far, or maybe it's one of those situations where their resources only go so far. Like if you get a $300 gas bill and you only have $200, you feel helpless because I don't have that extra $100. So we understand the idea of being helpless, and it's not that you're necessarily hopeless, which is something else, but the idea of being helpless is something we truly do get. But what does it mean to have learned helplessness? And the idea of that, is something that we tend to think of when we're looking at and trying to understand, today's people and today's, different generations that we have. And again, the focus, fairly or unfairly, tends to get put onto Gen Z. So when we think about the idea of this, it's important to understand that I'm not bashing Gen Z, because Gen Z was raised by someone. And it wasn't fellow Gen Zers. It was, millennial parents, or maybe even, the younger Gen X parents. But somebody raised them. So it's always important that whenever you're looking at a generation to remember someone raised them. So we got to keep that in mind. So when you look at and back up through generations, how were generations, how do they come to be? How do we tend to think of them? And a lot of times, nowadays we tend to put the label on them before they even come out. And then let them kind of come along and then see if we were right. But a lot of times we used to peg them otherwise. So when you look at before then you look at like what's known as a silent generation. And those are the folks who were, born and moving through the early 1900s. And you move, through like maybe through World War I. And, they're silent because they just buckled down and did the things that they're just supposed to do, and then they just did their thing. They didn't make a big splash. They didn't do a look at me moment or anything like that. They just moved along. And then you move into the World War II generation, or what some people call the greatest generation. These are the folks who were born, right at the beginning or through World War I, and they made it through the Depression, and they really came of age, in the World War II era. And so typically why they're called the greatest generation is one that, they made it through those things. And also because so many of them were involved in the World War II effort, whether it was the actual fighting itself or running factories or anything that they could do to supply, to be part of that war effort. And we're not talking a few thousand here and there. We're talking just millions upon millions of people. And these are the folks who really buckled down and did what they had to do to save the world. So that's why, you can understand them being called the greatest generation. They got home from the war, and what did they do? Well, they missed their loved ones, and they started procreating. And that's where we get baby boomers, because you had this boom, this population boom of all of these young men coming back from war, getting together with their girlfriends, getting married, or coming back to their wives, and just, when people miss each other, they do people things, and next thing you know, they're having children galore. And as a result, you have this big boom in population growth, hence the baby boomers. Now, the baby boomers, of course, when we think of baby boomers, we think of them being selfish and narcissistic. And we kind of wonder, well, why'd that happen? Well, realistically, when you think about the idea of you, let's say, just made it through war, you saw what happened in the Great Depression, and you saw war raging across the continent, and you've got a child, and you think to yourself, "Boy, I don't want my child to go through what I went through. So I'm going to, give them the upbringing that I didn't get, or that other people lost." So instead of like saying, "Well, that was the thing that we had to do. Now you're going to learn how to do the things you have to do," it was more of a lack of better words, a coddling along of this generation. Like, we just went through World War II. We don't want you to ever experience like that. So here's all this stuff to help you enjoy it. And the economy is booming through the 50s too. So in the 60s, so you see those kind of things happening where life was actually fairly good. I mean, granted, we did have a Korean War in there, and of course Vietnam, but compared in scope to World War II or World War I, those were actually minute. So if you have a very sheltered, pampered upbringing, what do you focus on? Self, and that becomes the thing. So parents are doting on you to make sure you're okay, and then then you're just doing your thing to enjoy that kind of upbringing. And the world is, for the most part, is at peace. The economy in the United States is booming, so you can see how the world, how the baby boomers became very much self-centered, very much narcissistic in their behavior, and selfish. So that's how we tend to think of them. Well, they had children, and that's where you get Gen X. Now, we saw this big movement of self in the baby boomers, including women empowerment movements, and as a result, women start flooding the workplace very heavily. So you have dad working, you have mom working, and then Gen X is born, and well, they're kind of left to be on their own. You've heard the term latchkey kids, meaning they'd come home from school, they'd have their own house key, they let themselves in, and they'd make themselves a snack. They'd maybe do their homework, they'd do whatever else, chores or things they need to do around the house, and they just made it happen. So you start seeing a situation with Gen Xers, the way that they were raised, that they become very much self-reliant. They very much become in a situation where they start seeing the idea that authority figures maybe necessarily can't be relied upon or trusted. So Gen Xers tend to be very much standoffish when it comes to authority figures. Not a big surprise, because they felt pretty much abandoned by them. So that's how they go into that group. And then you move into millennials, and millennials, they've got this. They've got the idea where the Xers think, well, I don't want my kid to feel like he's been abandoned, so we'll pay more attention to him. And you bring in, of course, the rise of technology and things like that too. That comes into play. And as a result, you end up having this generation who starts to look at their own lives, and again, they've been sheltered to some extent too. So they start thinking of themselves as being more important than they probably should think of themselves, and as a result, they start to become even more narcissistic than the baby boomers were. And of course, they got baby boomer grandparents who continue to dote on them now that they have a chance, because they blew it with their kids, so they dote on the grandkids. So the millennials then start to become very much narcissistic, and you start hearing of the term. It starts to come in the idea of the helicopter parent. And that's a Gen X parent that comes cruising in and floats above like a helicopter over top of the children to make sure everything is going okay. And they can swoop in and land if there's a situation. And you have that. Where things change, though, is when the millennials have their kids and we have Gen X or Gen Z. Now, Gen Z gets, born into an ultra technology lifestyle. Smartphones are already existent and plentiful. Satellite TV and everything like that is existent and plentiful. Big screen TVs are existent and plentiful. Gaming systems are existent and plentiful. So you see that's the whole lifestyle of tech is already there, and they're born into it. So they get basically, shoved into this world. So instead of being plopped in front of a TV, like maybe some Xers or millennials were, or just kicked outside to go figure out what to do, like some boomers or a lot of X's were, they're just given tech all the time. Like, shove the iPad in the face and say, I don't want to babysit you, I'm busy. Here's an iPad. Or we're at the restaurant and you're starting to fuss. Well, here's an iPad. Or we're at the grocery store and you're starting to fuss. Here's an iPad. And basically you have a situation where they're being raised by iPads instead of actually by people. And that changes a person a lot developmentally. And then so you have this iPad generation mentality start to come up. But on top of that, the parenting moved from the helicopter parent to a much more on-ground level of what I typically call the snowplow parent. So a snowplow parent is different than the helicopter parent because the helicopter parent just hovers and then swoops in if they have to. The snowplow parent just gets in and plows the road clean. So if you think of a snowplow, and if you're ever following a snowplow down the interstate, you either get into the snowy stuff and you're all sloshy and trying to figure out how to get going straight, or you just stick behind the plow because they're going to clear the road and make it smooth for you to make it easy travel. Well, if you have a parent that clears every bump, what do you think that's going to do to the kid? Any kind of problem that comes along, any kind of issue that comes along, they're not going to be able to understand how to solve it. They're not going to be able to figure out how to resolve any kind of speed bump that comes their way. So this learned helplessness becomes ingrained in their psyche of who they are. So as soon as they can't figure out something, mom jumps in, here, I'll get it for you. Or dad jumps in, let me fix that for you. Instead of saying, well, why isn't it working? What would you do? How would you fix it? Now, Gen Xer, if something broke, they didn't have anyone to ask. They had to figure out, which is why Gen Xers are typically super self-reliant. But we assume a lot of things, especially with Zs, because they were born into technology. And I've heard many, many times where people say Gen Z is the most technologically adept generation that there's ever been. And the answer to that is just, the truth of that, it's just not true. Spend time with Gen Z and you'll see that that's not true at all. They don't know or understand technology. They know how to use the basics of apps. So you grab a phone, and if I can do this, they can do it. They know how to swipe. And boy, they know a difference between swiping left and swiping right, and swiping up and swiping down. They know that really, really well. They know how to use and jump in and play with technology. They're not afraid to hop into and start using TikTok or Snapchat or any other thing that might come along next week or next year, whatever. They're not afraid to jump in and try it. But the thing is, there's a difference between basic use and knowing. So, Gen Xers, we grew up with typewriters that morphed into word processors, which morphed into big honking PCs. And when you bought a PC, it would come in this big box and everything would be loose and you'd have to figure out how everything goes together. And if something went wrong, you'd have to figure out, well, what folders do I click in? How far do I go down in submenus? Where do I learn how to get this thing to work? And that's what you learned. And you learned all the background stuff, basically what's going on behind the curtain, the proverbial curtain. There's not some wizard back there. There's a bunch of technology and stuff. You just have to figure out how it works to make it work. So that's what we were taught to do. And we were also inquisitive that way. So if you're out and about playing and your chain popped off your bike, well, you just had to figure out, how do I get this chain back on there? And you just work through some things, get your hands greasy until it gets back on there. You don't just stop playing for the day. Well, the problem with, if you've been raised by snowplow parents who just swooped in and fixed everything for you, you're used to everything working. And if it doesn't work, you're frozen cold because you never got a chance to develop those, how do I fix this in this situation type of skills. And that becomes a tremendous downfall for Gen Z. Now, of course, like I said, I don't want to bash Gen Z for it because who trained them? Who was that snowplow parent? So the snowplow parent did a massive disservice to them. So for example, I'm in a classroom and I'm teaching students how to use Adobe Creative Cloud. So I've got this classroom that's full of computers. I got 30 computers in my classroom, and they'll sit down and they'll move the mouse and nothing happens. And they'll say, it doesn't work. And they'll just raise their hand, Dr. Talbert, my mouse doesn't work. And they've just free solid. They have no idea. It's like, well, fix it. And they have no idea. It's hard for someone who's like a Gen Xer to grasp this concept because it's like, well, just fix it. But they don't even know how to start troubleshooting to go the steps. Now, again, I'm not bashing Gen Z, and I'm certainly not saying all Gen Zers are like this. I'm just, because there are some who have some self-reliance, because they've had parents who helped them with that. But it's not uncommon that a basic little thing happens and they have no idea how to move. They're frozen. It's not that they're afraid. It's just they don't even know the basics of troubleshooting. So you grab your mouse and you say, okay, this is a wired mouse or a wireless mouse. It's wired. Okay, well, where's the wire go? And lo and behold, it's unplugged. And it's literally that simple. But someone who's my generation goes, duh, it's unplugged. Look, fixed. But if they find an unplugged thing, they don't know where it goes. It's like, what do you mean you don't know where it goes? You just look at the back of the computer and you look at the plug and you see, oh, this is a USB type A, and here's a USB A slot, and just put it in. Well, there's 6 USB A slots. Which one do I put it in? Any of them? But they don't have that data set in their head to understand that's what you would have to do. They're frozen. So you get a computer, you get a phone, you get anything that stops working. It's just full stop, no idea. Because again, the way that they were raised, a snowplow parent came in and just cleared the deck, just pushed any problem that ever happened. They just did it. So even things like filling out basic forms, no idea, because mom always took care of it. What if I have a problem with a coworker? Mom would come and take care of it. What if I have a problem with this? Well, mom would come and take care of it. There is something that's staggering that I just saw a couple days ago in a news report. 50% of Gen Z job seekers bring a parent with them on a job interview. 50%. One of two. Like when they get called to a job interview, they bring a parent with them. I mean, that's mind-blowing for someone from Gen X, because it's just like, just go do it. Do what you got to do. Go get a job. Get out of my house, you bum. Go get a job. Yeah, that's how we were raised, is just go get a job. And you just go do the thing. And you go to the job interview and you trip up spectacularly. You fail and you don't get the job. And you learn that, okay, maybe don't do it that way. And you learn and you ask questions. How could I interview better? As opposed to, I don't know how to communicate with these people. Mom, Dad, someone help me take care of this. And snowplow parents are happy to. That's the other problem. Snowplow parents will like, well, here, son, let me help you. Let me jump in. Instead of saying, well, how do you think you should handle it? Let's talk about that. What if they ask you this? Are you ready? What if they ask you that? But again, if I've always had someone clearing the path for me, how can I do that? The other problem that comes in is if I've spent my life, again, the iPad generation, so I've always had this in front of my face. I've always scrolled, and this is a one-way thing. Yes, you're getting a video pumped at you, but my interaction is one way. I'm interacting by scrolling. There's not a person talking and interacting back. They're learning basically no interpersonal communication skills. So myself and another person, interpersonal, one-on-one communication, face-to-face, interpersonal communication skills, they're just not learning them, because this is how they interface all the time. When I first started teaching, these weren't around yet. So you'd walk into a classroom and people would be chatting and having a good time. These things started to become prevalent. And then you walk into a classroom and everyone's just doing this. You'd have 20 students and not once talking to each other. They'll make it the whole way through college and not have any friends because they spent their whole lives doing this. So they never learned this. So, of course, I ban these in my classroom. And as a result, they have to actually talk. So now when I walk into my classroom, they're actually talking to each other. And it's a refreshing thing. But it's one of those things that, like, why is that so weird? But to anyone who's, 30 and older, it's not really that weird. But someone who's 30 and younger, it's like, well, talking to somebody, I don't know. What if they have an answer? What if they ask me a question I don't have an answer for? I mean, so, I don't have anyone to come in and clear the path for me. And so you see this kind of thing where this idea of learned helplessness really becomes a thing, and it's truly a disservice. So what I want to be thinking about is when we move into discussions with others, if we ever see somebody hit a wall, especially if it's a Gen Zer who had a snowplow parent, instead of swooping in to fix it, ask them, how can we, what would be the best way to move forward? How would you handle this? How do you think we should go through? What would you do in this situation? Ask them those kind of probing questions to kind of get them to start thinking in those ways. Because sending them out into the world without any of those skills is a tremendous disservice to them, and it's not fair. And then as a result, Gen Z gets pegged with all kinds of things instead of just saying, actually, it was the Snowplow parent that taught them this learned helplessness. Help them stop being helpless. Ask them questions. Guide them. Shepherd them. Don't clear the path for them. Make them figure that part out. And that's always a hard part. And it's a hard part from parenting. It's a hard part in teaching because you want them to do well. But sometimes to do well, they need to be kind of let alone to fail. And then they kind of pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and start learning a lesson from that failure. Failure is important, and clearing that path takes that failure away. So don't let people fall into the trap of learned helplessness. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in this long anyway. But we'll see you next time on Communicology.